Take a breath, and let your shoulders soften. Allow your body to settle gently like snow upon a quiet forest path. Breathe in softly, and as you do, feel the stillness of night surrounding you. Imagine the warm weight of blankets pressing softly against your skin. The hush of twilight wrapping around you like a gentle cocoon. Let each breath guide you lower and deeper into calm. Now let your eyelids grow heavy. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Just listen and drift. Because tonight, our story sets sail on a crisp winter's dawn. In the heart of medieval France, picture with me the towering stones of the Chateau de Vincennes. Ancient, cold, and breathing history with every breath of wind. Their frost-covered surfaces shimmer softly beneath a pale morning sky, and somewhere far above, unseen birds stir quietly in the mist. A gentle breeze slips through the open courtyard, carrying with it the faintest scents, pine needles, moss clinging to damp stone, and distant hearth smoke curling from chimney tops. And then, slowly, the great wind doors creak open, not with urgency, but with care. Their hinges sigh into the silence. Beyond them lie shadowed corridors, wide, echoing halls, lit only by trembling candlelight flickering in iron sconces. The flames dance, casting long, swaying shadows across faded tapestries. Gold thread glimmers, deep blue velvet rustles ever so slightly as the morning air drifts in. And there, nestled in a quiet chamber tucked deep inside the fortress, lies a cradle. It is simple, carved from dark oak, its surface polished smooth by generations of royal hands. A single candle burns beside it, casting soft amber light across the tiny form within. Inside the cradle sleeps a child. His name is Charles the Sixth, a winter-born soul entering the world not with fanfare, but with silence. He was born in the earliest hours of December 3rd, 1368, just as the moon yielded to the first gray whispers of morning. His tiny chest rises and falls in a slow, steady rhythm, breath visible in the cold air, eyelids barely fluttering, fingers curled like petals in sleep. Even in birth, he seems drawn to dreams. Outside his chamber, the castle holds its breath. Servants move like shadows, soft-footed and careful. They carry warm cloths, loaves of fresh bread, water steeped with herbs. Their voices are hushed, their steps muffled against cold stone floors. Even the guards stationed nearby stand still, reverent in the presence of new life. And standing just a few steps away from the cradle is Charles's father, King Charles V, known to history as Charles the Wise, but here, in this moment, simply a father. He leans quietly over his son, his fingers lined with years of governance, yet trembling with gentleness. He studies the boy's sleeping face, wondering not just what this child will be, but whether the world will be kind to him. No words are spoken. They aren't needed. The chamber is quiet, peaceful, the kind of stillness that feels sacred. And so the days begin for young Charles. In the weeks that follow, he rarely cries. His world is one of soft linens and whispered prayers, the slow rhythm of lullabies sung in Latin, of warm hands and slower time. A monk recites verses in a voice like a tide rolling in, his words lifting and falling in gentle cadence. A nurse sits near the hearth, humming as she weaves. A tutor reads poetry, his voice trailing like drifting smoke, and all the while, Charles listens, barely waking, as if sleep is his natural state, as if the world is too loud, and dreams are where he truly lives. Outside, the seasons turn. Winter yields to spring, and spring to summer. Slowly, softly, life continues. By the time Charles can walk, he does so with the careful steps of someone always watching the ground beneath him. He explores the inner courtyard of the castle, tiny fingers brushing ivy on stone walls, feet padding across damp moss between cracks in the stone. The air is thick with quiet. A bird sings somewhere above. A fountain trickles nearby, its water catching the afternoon light. Charles looks up only occasionally, as if seeing the world in fragments, through the slow blink of a dreamer. Sometimes, when no one is watching, Charles will pause beside a patch of dandelions pushing up through the cracks. He crouches low, his fingers just grazing the petals, and he stares, not in wonder exactly, but in stillness, as if even the smallest flower holds some quiet secret he alone understands. And in those moments, the wind doesn't blow, the birds seem to hush their wings, and time folds into itself. Even the sun, filtering down through high stone windows, appears to move more gently, more slowly. When it touches Charles, he is a quiet child, not out of shyness, but out of something deeper, a kind of softness that the world doesn't always understand. By the age of 4, he's begun to speak in sentences, but only when necessary, and even then, his voice is low, barely louder than a whisper. His mother often smiles at this, running her fingers through his soft curls and saying, "My son dreams with his eyes open." There's a moment, one early morning, when the nursemaid finds him standing at the window in his night clothes, his tiny hands pressed against the cold glass. Outside, the fog is thick, and a fox trots silently across the courtyard. She asks him gently, "What do you see, little one?" He doesn't turn. He only replies, almost to himself, "Everything," but nothing is moving. The nurse just watches him, unsure whether to answer. And in the quiet, she realizes Charles sees the world differently. As the years pass, the boy grows, but that softness stays. While other noble children run and shout and knock over goblets in the hall, Charles sits in the shade of a column, running his fingers along the seams of old stone. He listens when the elders speak. He listens when no one speaks. He listens to everything. And yet, even in the silence, something stirs. There's a tremble behind his eyes sometimes, a flicker of unease when the room is too bright, or when too many voices speak at once. His tutors notice it. They speak of it in hushed tones behind closed doors. He's sensitive, one says. Dreamy, another adds. A little too quiet. But his father, King Charles V, only smiles at the boy's stillness. "He hears more than we do," he says once, softly. He feels what others miss, and truly Charles does feel, deeply. When a pigeon falls from the battlement one day, its wing injured and limp, Charles kneels beside it for hours. His small hands cup gently around the tiny body. He asks the stable boy to bring water. He wraps the wing in linen strips. But when the bird dies in the night, Charles doesn't cry. He simply sits by the window again, watching the stars blink slowly in and out of view. As if searching for a place where nothing ever breaks, the world continues around him. Dinners are held. Bells ring in the chapel tower. Advisors and nobles come and go through the castle gates, but Charles drifts through it all, quiet as breath. And though his heart is full and his soul tender, some begin to wonder if he is too quiet, too still. But the truth is, he is just waiting for something he doesn't yet understand. Seasons pass again. The castle changes its clothes with each shift of weather. Stone floors cold beneath bare feet in winter. Tapestries drawn tight against the draft. Then flung wide comes spring, when birdsong echoes through open shutters and the scent of lilacs floats down from the hills beyond Paris. Charles grows taller, but not louder. At age 7, he receives his first ceremonial tunic, royal blue with gold embroidery, too stiff at the shoulders. He fidgets in it quietly, lips pressed tight, while others celebrate his milestone with songs and clapping hands. And all the while, Charles watches like a guest in his own story. One afternoon, His mother finds him tucked behind a curtain near the chapel. She gently pulls it aside. "You missed the feast," she says softly, crouching down. "They toasted your name, Charles." The boy doesn't look at her right away. His eyes stay on the stained glass, red and green light splashed across the floor like spilled jewels. Finally, he whispers, "I liked it here, it was quiet." And instead of coaxing him back to the celebration, his mother sits beside him. In that small space behind the curtain, they sit for a long time, saying nothing, just breathing, letting the stillness settle. Because sometimes love is knowing when not to speak. As he enters his 9th year, a tutor is appointed, Master Gervais, a patient man with soft eyes and a voice like wool. He teaches Charles the names of kings and rivers, saints and storms, but most days their lessons wander off the page. One morning, while reading a passage on the stars, Charles interrupts gently. "Do they listen?" he asks, pointing to the sky. "To what, my lord?" the tutor says, puzzled. "To us," Charles replies. "When we're quiet." Master Gervais doesn't laugh. He only nods, folding the book shut. "They do, I think," he says, "especially when the world grows too loud." And Charles smiles, the kind of smile that disappears quickly, but leaves something warm behind. At night, his dreams come thick and vivid. He speaks softly in sleep, murmuring to people who aren't there, naming places he's never seen. The nursemaids whisper about it. Some say he's touched by angels. Others wonder if it's something darker. But Charles, he doesn't fear these dreams. In fact, he seems to live more fully in them. Once, when asked if he remembered what he dreamed, he said, "It was a forest, and the trees were speaking. But I couldn't understand their words. I think I was too awake. The world outside is shifting. France is restless, tensions rising between neighbors, armies stirring, alliances whispered behind velvet curtains. But within the thick stone walls of Vincennes, Charles remains a gentle ghost, gliding through the halls, observing rather than acting, listening rather than speaking. Some wonder if he's fit to rule. Others say he was born with too soft a soul for a crown. But his father still watches him with quiet trust. He is slow to speak, he once tells an advisor, but when he does, you'll find the truth resting gently in his words. Mark them. And the advisor nods, though he doesn't quite understand, because Charles sees the world not in battles or borders, but in shadows and sighs, in the silent flutter of curtains when no one is near. In the small ways light spills into dark corners. He is not like other boys, but perhaps he is something else entirely. By his 12th year, the boy prince begins to notice that others speak about him when they think he cannot hear. Servants lower their voices when he enters a room. Advisors exchange looks. Even the court physician watches him not with concern, but with curiosity. Charles, in his quiet way, notices everything. He notices the way his own name sometimes trembles in people's mouths. The boy dreams too deeply, one whispers. He walks the gardens barefoot, says another, even in the rain. But Charles never responds to these murmurs. He simply continues, floating through the halls of his childhood like a poem, unfinished and open to interpretation. On one particularly gray morning, he is found sitting in the old scriptorium where no one had studied for years. Dust motes drift in the slanted light. A broken quill lies on the floor beside him. He is not writing. He is listening. "What do you hear?" asks a servant, gently curious. Charles looks toward the vaulted ceiling, where pigeons rustle. "The past," he whispers. "It talks more softly here." The servant doesn't know how to reply, but he stays beside him, just listening, because sometimes the gift isn't in speaking. It's in sharing the silence. Charles turns 14, then 15. And the day comes when the throne is no longer just something he is meant to inherit, but something he must prepare to sit upon. His tutors shift. He is now taught the mechanics of governance, treaties, tariffs, taxation. Scrolls line the tables. His hours are filled with lessons on policy and war, but Charles still drifts through them. He retains knowledge, yes, but he holds it loosely, like sand slipping between fingers. His mind remains a wanderer, a listener. One evening, an ambassador from Navarre arrives, draped in silks and eager to test the future king's wisdom. Charles listens carefully to his long-winded proposal, fingers idly tracing the edge of his cup. When the man finishes, Charles says softly, "You used 20 words when 5 would do." The ambassador flushes, caught off guard, and Charles sips his wine without another word. His voice is soft, yes, but not empty. There's something behind his eyes, a flicker, a glimmer, like the last light at dusk that doesn't ask to be noticed, but refuses to fade. Yet even as he matures, something stays untouched in him. He does not chase the company of others, does not hunger for applause or laughter. He is most alive in gardens, in chapels, in the still places where time feels slower. His mother watches him with both love and worry. "Do you feel alone, my son?" she asks one quiet evening. Charles, now 17, turns his gaze to the fire. He watches the way the flames bend and fold in on themselves. "No," he says finally, "just between." And though she does not fully understand what he means, she reaches for his hand. It is cool, gentle, and she holds it like a prayer. Outside, the world grows noisier. France is aching from war, from loss, from unrest. But inside Charles, there is only the hum of something distant, like wind through trees or footsteps on long-forgotten stairs. Something old and hard to name. Charles turns 21, and the crown is placed upon his head, gold, heavy, forged for kings long before him. It rests against his brow, not as a trophy, but as a burden. The coronation is grand, silks and trumpets and incense. But to Charles, it feels like a dream layered on top of another dream. He stands still beneath the vaulted ceiling of Rheims Cathedral, sunlight pouring through stained glass like colored water. He hears the chants, the footsteps, the murmurs, but inside, silence, a profound, echoing silence. Later that night, when the halls have emptied and the feasting has stilled, Charles stands alone in the echo of it all. His fingers touch the crown resting on a velvet pillow nearby. "I don't feel different," he murmurs to the shadows. A monk nearby, old and half asleep, blinks and replies, "That's because you were born with it, Majesty." The crown is just a mirror. And for a brief moment, Charles wonders what exactly it's reflecting. The first years of his rule are quiet. He leans heavily on his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou, who guide France's affairs while Charles drifts between council chambers and chapel pews. He signs papers without always reading them, nods during meetings where the words feel like birds chirping far away, constant and incomprehensible. At times, he seems entirely lucid, sharp, even, asking questions that surprise his council, remembering details they'd long forgotten, but at other times, his eyes cloud. He speaks of voices in the wind, of dreams that seem more real than daylight, and once, while standing in the cathedral's crypt, he places a hand on a sarcophagus and whispers, "They're still awake, you know, just not here." A chill moves through the stone walls that day. Still, he marries. In 1385, he weds Isabeau of Bavaria, a young woman with wide eyes and an uncertain heart. She is beautiful, smart, but unprepared for the strange tides of her husband's mind. Their wedding is celebrated with splendor, dancing, banners, gold. But even as the crowds cheer, Charles watches the sky. "There's a storm coming," he says softly. "The sky is clear." But he's not wrong. The storm just hasn't reached him yet. Over the next months, Charles drifts in and out of himself. There are days he laughs with his knights, hunts through the forests, praises poets, and quotes Virgil by memory. But then something changes. A darkness begins to coil at the edge of his mind. At first it is small, a lost train of thought, a forgotten name, a hesitation before signing royal decrees. But soon it grows. In one strange episode, he becomes convinced he is made of glass. He walks carefully, slowly, afraid that any wrong movement might shatter him. He demands special clothing, reinforced with iron rods, to keep his fragile body from breaking. Those around him do not mock him. They whisper instead. He is tired. He is delicate. He works too hard. But behind closed doors, fear begins to creep. France needs a king, not a ghost wrapped in velvet, and Charles, he fades. Sometimes gently, like mist evaporating from stone. Other times suddenly, like a flame blown out too soon. One summer, in the middle of a forested journey, the darkness finally strikes with full force. It is a quiet day. The sun filters through the trees. The horses clip-clop softly across the woodland path. And then, with no warning, Charles turns to his escort and screams. His eyes wild, his face twisted in terror. He draws his sword and strikes down one of his own knights before collapsing to the ground, trembling. The forest, once peaceful, holds its breath. No one moves. Not for a long time. The forest never forgot that day. Neither did the people of France. From then on, something in Charles was broken. He would have moments of clarity, soft, gentle moments where he'd smile and speak of music, of the stars, of peace. But they would not last, like a candle flickering before a gust of wind. His episodes returned unannounced, each one a little darker, a little deeper. There were days he could not recognize his wife, nights when he didn't remember he was king, and sometimes he forgot he was even a man. He'd wander the halls of his palace muttering, convinced he was made of glass again. Guards and servants were instructed not to touch him, not even brush past him. He feared shattering into 1,000 invisible shards. Isabel would sit at his bedside during these spells, her fingers barely touching the edge of his sleeve. "He's here," she'd whisper, "still here, just beneath the fog." But the fog was thickening. The court, uncertain how to manage their ruler's fractured mind, began to divide. Powers shifted into the hands of Charles's uncles, each with their own agendas, their own ambitions. France became a kingdom ruled by whispers and shadows, with Charles floating above it all like a ghost wearing a crown. One winter, he sat in his chambers for days, staring out a frost-covered window. He did not speak, did not eat, just watched. When asked what he was looking for, he whispered, "The part of me that remembers." Sometimes even memory slipped from him like silk through fingers. He'd ask where he was, who he was. And in those moments, the King of France became simply a man, adrift. His daughter once brought him a flower, a soft white bloom wrapped in parchment. He stared at it for a long while, then held it to his chest and said, "It smells like childhood." She didn't understand then. But years later, she would remember that moment more clearly than anything else, because it was the last time he looked at her with eyes full of clarity. The kingdom began to crumble under the weight of uncertainty. The people, confused and frightened, whispered of demons, of curses, of madness and royal blood. They blamed sorcery, the stars, his advisors, his wife, but never the truth. The truth was simply sorrow, a sorrow too deep for a single man to hold. And so Charles drifted for years, sometimes lucid, his voice soft and poetic, his eyes sharp and kind, and other times gone, trapped in worlds no one else could see, realms of glass and shadows, voices and smoke. The council created regencies. Power passed hands like fragile glass, always at risk of shattering, just like their king. And through it all, France waited for their Charles to return, waited for their dreamer to awaken. But dreams are strange things. They don't always end the way we expect. Take another breath, slow and soft. Let the air settle in your chest like snow drifting upon a still lake. And now, imagine time itself growing tired. The world around Charles VI begins to quiet, as if even history is holding its breath. Years have passed. The boy once cradled beneath flickering candlelight is now a man grown gray, though he hardly notices the mirror anymore. His body grows frail, his voice a whisper, but his mind, it remains a labyrinth. Sometimes he wanders through memories as if they were rooms he once lived in. Other times he disappears entirely, eyes glazed, lips trembling as he murmurs to someone who isn't there. France, meanwhile, weeps. The kingdom torn by the 100 Years' War trembles under divided rule. Civil unrest, hunger, fear, they spread like ivy across crumbling stone. England presses harder. Burgundy twists alliances like a dagger. The court is no longer a place of whispered lullabies or soft-lit corridors. It is a battleground of silks and lies, and Charles, he floats through it all. There are days he believes he's a saint, nights he claims to be dead already. One morning, he refuses to dress. The attendants plead. He sits quietly, his hands folded, and says, "Why would a ghost need robes?" Yet even in these broken hours, glimpses of his soul shine through. A nurse once placed a sparrow on his windowsill. The bird fluttered its wings, chirped once, and took flight. Charles watched it disappear into the gray sky and whispered, "I hope it remembers how to come back." One of his last lucid conversations was with a young servant boy who'd never known the king as anything but strange and silent. Charles turned to him, smiled faintly, and said, "Tell them I tried. I really did." The boy didn't understand, but when he grew old, he did. He remembered that moment every time the wind moved softly through tall grass. Every time the night was quiet enough to hear his own thoughts. In his final year, Charles barely speaks. The palace is colder, his room smaller. The tapestries are faded, the walls worn down by time. He sleeps most days, drifts, and when he dreams, perhaps he returns to that courtyard from his childhood, where ivy climbed stone, where moss grew between cracks, where robins sang gently from oak branches. Perhaps he walks again through the garden, tiny fingers brushing against dew-covered leaves, and finds, in that silent place, the peace he could never hold as king. And so, on a bitter January morning, in the year 1422, Charles VI, the King of France, the man of glass, the quiet dreamer, slips away, not with trumpets, not with fanfare, but softly, like the last breath of winter before spring begins to stir. His reign ends not with strength, but with sorrow, not with glory, but with silence. He ruled for over 40 years, but in truth, he spent much of it sleeping, and yet, maybe that's why we remember him not as a conqueror, but as a fragile soul who wandered too deeply into dreams and never quite found the way back. Now, dear listener, take another breath. Let that story rest softly in your heart. Let the wind of time drift past your thoughts, and feel, even now, how the tale of a broken king can still hold beauty. The wind outside the royal tombs hums like a lullaby. Long after Charles VI's passing, the world continued on. France would change again and again, shifting under kings, emperors, revolutions. And yet, somewhere deep within its layered memory, Charles remained, not as a warrior, not as a strategist, but as something rarer, a reminder of fragility, a whisper of what happens when power rests in trembling hands. After his death, the people spoke of his reign with mixed tones, some of grief, others of shame, a few of deep, aching sympathy, but all agreed he was not cruel, and that in an age of burning heretics and sharpened swords, was something worth remembering. He had lived much of his life inside himself. Historians debated whether it was madness or melancholy, whether it was demons or dreams, but in the end, perhaps Charles was simply too soft for the weight of a crown. And still, even through the chaos, there were those who loved him. A nurse who said he smiled like a candle in a storm. A scribe who once caught him tracing shapes in frost upon a window pane. A servant who swore that on certain days he'd look at her as if he truly saw her, not as a servant, but as someone who mattered. And in tapestries woven long after his death, artists didn't paint him with swords or scepters. They showed him with hands folded, eyes closed, a crown resting beside his head. Not on it, as if to say, here was a king who ruled not with fire, but with silence. Not with might, but with mourning. He was the king who watched shadows dance across his chamber wall. The king who saw saints in doorways. The king who once stopped a procession just to listen to the song of a single nightingale. And perhaps, in some small way, that makes him unforgettable. Because even in his brokenness, Charles was human. Beautifully, painfully, quietly. Human. And so, dear listener, as your breath slows once more, as your body sinks a little deeper into stillness, remember this. Not all kings are carved of iron. Some are made of glass. And though they crack, even shatter, they catch the light in ways no warrior ever could. Tonight, you rest alongside such a soul. You walk the quiet gardens of history with him. And as the fire of this tale dims into embers, know that you too are held gently in memory. Like a soft lullaby on a cold, forgotten night, sleep now if you wish. Let your thoughts drift like the morning fog over the Chateau de Vincennes. And if your dreams should bring you to that old stone courtyard, perhaps you'll see him there, still walking slowly, still listening to the wind, still lost and at peace. Within the world of sleep, take one more soft breath, dear listener. Let the hush of the room hold you like a lullaby. Let your eyes soften, your limbs grow heavy once more, and come with me one last time through the corridors of memory. Because though our story nears its end, history never truly stops speaking. There are places in France where, even now, the air feels different. A certain hallway in the Louvre where the paintings seem to watch you with something older than sight. A worn stone bench in a quiet garden near St. Ouen, where the ivy has swallowed nearly every edge, save for one gentle curve, said to have been smoothed by the hands of a silent king. And of course, the ruins of the Hotel St. Paul, once a sanctuary, now a shadow. It was here that Charles felt safest, hidden within the tall walls and soft candlelight. He would wander those echoing halls barefoot, trailing his fingers along the walls, whispering to people who were no longer there. Some say he was talking to angels, others to ghosts, but maybe he was just speaking to memory. You see, the mind can be a palace, vast and endless, but also a labyrinth. One hallway opens into another and another, until you no longer know where you began. Charles lived in such a maze, and he never found the exit, but he learned to make a kind of home there. There are stories of how he would sit for hours in the garden, speaking softly to the hedges, calling them by names only he knew, of how he believed he was made of glass, and begged his attendants not to touch him, fearing he would shatter, and perhaps, in some way, he already had. But oh, how delicately he held what remained, even when his crown was lifted. When his robes were removed, he remained noble in a way few understood, not by decree, but by dignity. They say the people of Paris grew quieter when they saw him, not out of fear, but reverence. As if even they knew that something sacred lingered in his silence, and when the bells of Notre Dame tolled in his memory, they rang not just for a king, but for a boy who once watched snow fall from a tower window, for a man who chased sunlight across stained glass floors, for a soul who wanted nothing more than to be understood and left in peace. Let your breath come softly now, and through your nose, out through your lips. There's no rush, no wait. Only the stillness of night and the echo of memory. Because tonight, we're not walking through history, we're walking through feeling. And as we follow the soft footsteps of Charles VI, we begin to understand. His life was not one of conquests or grand speeches. It was a life lived inside the quiet corridors of his mind, inside rooms where only he could hear the music, inside silences where the world dared not tread. He may have worn a crown, but the kingdom he ruled most faithfully was the one within. Historians often measure greatness by victories, by maps redrawn, by treaties signed in gold, ink, and blood. But what of the kings who never lifted a sword, who never roared from a balcony, who ruled not by might, but by memory? Charles's reign was marked by whispers, by long pauses between words, by eyes that stared just past the people speaking to him, as if watching something the rest could not see. Was it madness, or was it escape? Because sometimes the mind builds walls when the world outside is too loud. And within those walls, Charles wandered. One nurse once said she found him humming to a flower pot. Another servant recalled a moment when he pressed his hand to a window pane and whispered, "This is the edge of everything." But even in these moments, he was gentle, even in disarray. He never lashed out with cruelty. There was sadness, yes, but no fire. And in that gentleness, something beautiful remained. There's a quiet dignity in surviving the storms of the mind. And Charles survived more than most. Now, dear listener, breathe in again slowly and let the air settle deep into your belly. Let your body grow heavier like the roots of a sleeping tree. And if your dreams take you back to the stone gardens of the Hotel St. Paul, if you see a man standing still in the morning mist, a crown resting in the grass beside him, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer to no one but the wind, smile for him. Because even kings, the lost ones, the soft ones, the fragile ones, deserve to be remembered with kindness. Picture the halls of the Hotel St. Paul, not in their grandeur, but in their dimmest hour. The once lavish tapestries now droop with age. The vibrant reds faded, the gold thread no longer shining. The floors, once alive with the hurried steps of messengers and nobility, now echo with something heavier, like memory. And in a chamber at the far end of the corridor, behind a thick wooden door kept closed far more often now, sits the king, Charles VI. But the man who stares into the hearth as gentle flames is not the boy we once knew in the gardens of Vincennes. His face is older, thinned by time and worn by storms that were never of this world. His hair has grayed in streaks. His hands tremble as they rest in his lap, not from age, but from battles fought within. There are days now, long stretches of them, when he no longer knows who he is, when mirrors must be covered because the reflection staring back feels like a stranger, and on the worst days, he does not know he is king at all. On one such evening, a servant brings warm broth in a carved wooden bowl, the same kind used when Charles was a child. She enters gently as she always does. But today, Charles looks at her not with suspicion, not with fury, but with wonder. He studies her face like a child meeting someone for the first time. And then, softly, almost in a whisper, he asks, "Have you seen my mother?" The question hangs there, suspended between time and memory. The servant nods, as she always does, and Charles smiles. Faintly, as if that answer alone has calmed something inside him, then he turns back to the fire, not speaking again for hours. You see, not all madness is loud. Some of it moves like a fog, slow, gentle, quiet. But it erases and it rearranges. And it leaves a person somewhere in between the world and their own mind. The court around him learned how to adjust. Advisors whispered instead of speaking. Meetings were delayed. Rules were quietly rewritten to accommodate moments when the king disappeared. But sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, Charles would begin to hum a song no one recognized. A lullaby, perhaps, from a time before memory. He'd trace patterns on the velvet of his sleeve, or talk softly to someone no one else could see. And once, just once, he stood in the garden again. It was winter. Snow fell in delicate flakes across the dark hedges. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Beautiful." Even when the world forgets me. That night, one of the guards wept. Because even in the shadow of madness, there was still something luminous in the king. Something fragile and clear, like light through stained glass. And so the story moves forward, not in grandeur, but in quiet. Because Charles, though broken, still lived, still walked, still breathed. Not as a ruler of armies, but as a soul suspended in the tender space between reality and dreaming. The years went on, and with each passing season, Charles's world grew both larger and more distant. He was no longer the quiet boy wandering through courtyards of ivy and moss. He had grown tall, with the frame of a king, and the eyes of a dreamer who never quite woke, but something had changed. The court whispered of it first, quietly, cautiously. A pause in conversation, a look passed between nobles, as if they were afraid that even speaking of it too loudly might summon something they didn't yet understand. It began with small moments. Charles forgetting names he had known for years, pausing mid-sentence, eyes distant, his hand trembling slightly when he lifted a goblet. At first, people made excuses. He was tired, they said, or burdened with the weight of the crown. Who wouldn't be? But then came the episodes. They arrived like storms on an otherwise still sea, sudden, violent, confusing. He once leapt from his throne in the middle of court, screaming that enemies were hiding behind the walls, ordering guards to draw their swords, not against armies, but against shadows. Another time, he forgot who his wife was. He looked at her blankly, politely, as if she were a stranger offering him bread on the side of the road. The people began to murmur. Priests were called. Physicians whispered of humors, of imbalance, of curses. Some blamed sorcery. Others spoke of God's punishment. But those who loved him, they only saw a man unraveling from the inside, thread by thread, each break invisible, until the whole tapestry began to tear. And yet, there were still days, soft, rare days, when Charles would sit in the garden, quiet, calm, watching the wind stir the leaves. He'd hum an old tune from his childhood, the kind his nurse might have sung when the world still made sense. On those days, he was almost himself again, and oh, how the court would cling to those hours, pretending just for a while that nothing was wrong, that the king was only tired, not broken. But even dreams cave. Even dreams can only hold for so long, and deep inside, Charles began to disappear, not all at once, but slowly, like a candle flickering in a corridor where no one walks anymore. The corridors of the palace grew quieter, not in sound, but in spirit. There were still footsteps, still the shuffling of robes and the rustle of parchment. But something had shifted, the kind of silence that doesn't come from stillness, but from waiting for the king to return to himself. Sometimes he would, for a moment or an hour. A flicker of clarity would light his gaze. He would smile at someone and call them by name, and they would hold their breath, willing the moment to stay. But like mist in the sun, it always slipped away. There was a day, one cold morning, when Charles stood before a mirror for nearly an hour, not fixing his robes, not adjusting his crown, just staring. When his servant finally stepped forward and gently asked, "Your Majesty, is everything all right?" Charles turned to him with soft confusion and said, I see someone in the glass, but I do not know if it is me. That moment was never recorded in the official annals. No chronicler inked it onto parchment. But the servant remembered until the end of his life. Because sometimes the most important parts of history aren't written in books. They're held quietly in the hearts of those who stood nearby. Outside the walls, France was stirring. Plots formed in candlelit rooms. Alliances shifted like river tides. And war, as always, waited just beyond the hills. But inside Charles's world, time felt different. Like it moved in circles, repeating and folding in on itself, until even he didn't know which year it was, or which face belonged to which memory. And yet, somewhere in him, the boy from the cradle still lingered, the one who traced sunlight on stone, the one who walked slowly beneath ivy-covered walls, the one who stopped to listen to a bird's song, even when the world rushed around him. He was still there, lost, yes, but not gone, not yet. And on the rarest of days, you could still find him in the garden, eyes half closed, whispering to the wind. There came a moment, one pale afternoon, when the king wandered past the guards without a word, no advisors, no ceremony, just Charles walking alone. He moved slowly, as though the stone beneath his feet had changed, as though the world itself felt unfamiliar. The courtyard was still. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and distant firewood, and above, the clouds drifted like ships without sails. Gray, quiet, endless. Charles paused near an old oak tree, the same one that had shaded him as a boy. He reached out, fingers brushing the bark, rough, cold, real, and then he knelt, right there in the earth, not like a king, not like a ruler, but like a man returning to something lost. A servant had seen him, quietly watching from a distance, not daring to approach. And he swore. In that single moment, Charles looked utterly at peace, as if, for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to remember or to understand. He was simply there, present, breathing. The king rested his palm against the soil, closed his eyes, and whispered something no one else could hear. Some said it was a prayer. Others thought it might have been a name, but most believed it wasn't meant for anyone except the earth itself. He stayed like that until dusk. And when he finally rose, there was dirt on his robes, leaves in his hair, and a softness in his face that hadn't been seen in a very long time. That evening, the castle grew still earlier than usual. Servants spoke in whispers. The hearths were stoked but low, their fires crackling like distant lullabies. Charles returned to his chamber without a word. He didn't summon his physicians. He didn't ask for food or ink or prayer. He simply sat by the window, watching the last pale light disappear behind the trees. From this room, the same room he had known since boyhood, he could still see the rooftops of Paris, distant, blurred by time and twilight. He rested his forehead against the glass, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was waiting for something, a sound, a face, a memory to arrive, but none came. Only the gentle wind brushing the shutters, only the creak of old wood settling, and still he waited. In the corner of the room, a candle burned low. Its flame trembled, as if unsure whether to live or die. Just like him, perhaps. Later that night, a servant entered quietly to check on him. But the king didn't stir. He was still at the window, still silent, except his hand had fallen open on the sill, and in it was a folded scrap of parchment, no seal, no markings. Just an old line of poetry scribbled long ago in his own hand. To dream is to belong, if only for a moment, to peace. The servant didn't speak. She simply placed a blanket over his shoulders and left the room in silence. The next morning, light crept in slowly, spilling across the floor in golden ribbons. Dust drifted through it like tiny stars suspended in time, and Charles was still at the window, still wrapped in the same quiet, the same hush that had followed him since boyhood. But something had changed. There was peace now, not the peace of sound sleep, but the stillness of final release. A maid, the same one who used to hum lullabies in the corridor, found him there. His eyes were closed. His lips parted slightly, as though caught mid-breath, mid-dream. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she knelt beside him and folded his hands softly in his lap. The parchment still rested nearby. Its ink faded, but the words clear. To dream is to belong, if only for a moment, to peace. And in that moment, as the sun warmed the ancient stones of the chateau, as bells began to toll far in the distance, Charles was no longer a king, no longer a ghost of madness or melancholy, but simply a soul at rest. Let yourself breathe gently now. You're still wrapped in the candlelit hush of a forgotten century. The year is 1420. France is no longer whole. It is no longer certain. The Treaty of Troyes is signed, and with it, a quiet fracture deepens inside Charles, one that had begun so many years ago, now widened by ink and seal. This treaty, this fragile parchment, denies his own son the right to inherit the crown. It names Henry V of England as heir to France. Yes, England, a foreign king, the blood of his enemies, promised the throne Charles still wore. The decision had not come from Charles alone. Others signed it too, advisors, nobles, even his own wife, Isabeau of Bavaria. But Charles, he was still king in name, and the seal was pressed with his trembling hand. Did he know what he was doing? Did he understand the weight of this moment? Some say yes, that even in his moments of clarity, he believed it would bring peace to a nation bleeding from within. Others say no, that he was too far gone, that those around him moved his hand like a puppet's. But what we do know is that after the signing, Charles fell into one of his longest silences. He no longer spoke. He no longer rose. The rooms of the Hotel St. Paul, once filled with music and soft poetry, now echoed with absence. His attendants whispered less. The doctors stopped asking questions. Even the servants tiptoed more carefully, as if the silence might crack if touched too roughly. He sat, day after day, by the same window, watching the same sky. Some said he was praying. Others said he was simply waiting. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps Charles was waiting for the world to end, or for his name to be forgotten. But still, he lingered. In the final years of his life, he rarely left his chambers. The world outside grew darker. Henry V would die unexpectedly. His son, a baby not yet able to speak, would be crowned king of both England and France. And meanwhile, the true son of Charles, the Dauphin, wandered in exile, declared illegitimate by treaty, yet held as hope by loyalists. France was now a house split in two. And Charles, the man once crowned with music and silver and thunderous bells, sat quietly in a chair worn thin by time. He had no words left, no strength to argue, no crown upon his head. Only the slow creak of floorboards, only the soft ticking of moments that refused to stop. But in his stillness, there was still something human. A flicker behind the eyes, a heartbeat beneath the linen, a soul waiting for release. It is the winter of 1422. Paris is cold, the kind of cold that wraps around bones, that lingers behind window panes like a ghost pressing its face to the glass. Inside the Hotel St. Paul, the once proud royal residence now dimmed by neglect, Charles lies in his bed. The fire beside him crackles, but he does not stir. His skin is pale, translucent, almost like paper that's been folded too many times. He is 53, but looks far older, not because of time, but because of sorrow. Outside, France shifts on fragile legs. The people are tired, the nobles are restless, and still, Charles breathes, not deeply, not steadily, but enough. A nurse keeps vigil at his side. She does not speak, she only watches. Her hands are folded, her eyes glassy. She remembers a different Charles, the boy who once reached for sunlight through garden windows. Now he stares only at shadows on the wall. There is no royal court at his bedside, no music, no celebration. Just a still room, a cold wind, and the slow fading of a man once called king. He does not recognize his own reflection anymore. Perhaps he hasn't in years. Sometimes he murmurs names, not of statesmen, not of allies, but of animals he once kept, of a garden gate, of a dream he once had, something about floating on a river of stars, and then, on October 21st, his breath catches and stops. No fanfare, no thunder, no final word, just silence. Charles VI of France passes away quietly, as he lived, as he ruled. Some say the moment he died, a candle went out on its own. Others say the wind outside whispered his name, and then fell still. There was no parade, no grand monument erected that night, just the beginning of a memory, a long echo that would stretch across centuries. The Mad King, they'd call him, the broken one. But you, dear listener, you know him differently. You've walked beside him through dreams and gardens. You've watched him search the sky for meaning. You've seen not a madman, but a human being. Fragile, forgotten, and deeply, achingly real. So as you lie here now, eyes growing heavy with sleep, let the final breath of this story curl around you like mist. Rest with him a little longer. Let the stillness take root. And when you drift into dreams tonight, may they be soft and silent and full of stars. Like the river Charles once imagined. The world didn't pause when Charles passed, but something shifted. In the quiet corners of Paris, people lit candles. Not because they loved their king deeply, most never knew him that way, but because something about his story stayed with them. There's a sadness that lingers when a soul like his disappears. A sadness that doesn't shout, it sighs. Years would pass. Kings would rise. Wars would thunder through the land like iron storms. But here and there, someone would remember. An old monk who once heard Charles hum to himself in the gardens. A washerwoman who said he used to pause mid-procession just to hand her child a coin. A boy who watched the king smile at pigeons, as if they were his counsel. And then there were the shadows of the Hotel St. Paul. Long after Charles was gone, some claim they saw a figure wandering its dim corridors, not frightening, not cruel, just lost. A pale figure pausing before empty rooms, listening to silence, touching the walls like they were memories. People whispered it was his spirit, but others said no. It was just a dream the city itself kept having. You see, sometimes when a soul has been quiet for too long, the world dreams for them. And Charles, he had been quiet all his life. Quiet when crowned, quiet when mocked, quiet when broken. It was only fair that the silence whispered back. Even his burial carried no thunder. He was laid to rest in St. Denis, the resting place of kings. But unlike others, no great monument was raised overnight, no grand songs written in his honor. Only time would give him that. Only time and memory. And so, dear listener, as you breathe gently now, and let the weight of your body settle a little deeper, know that this part of his story, this lingering echo, is just as sacred. For it is not only in life that a soul speaks, but in what is remembered, what is mourned, what is whispered in hushed voices long after the candles have gone out. Charles still exists. Not in marble, not in triumph, but in softness and hush, in night, in you. The wind outside the royal crypts had changed. It no longer carried the heavy sorrow of a kingdom in mourning, just the quiet hush of time passing softly, slowly. Charles VI was gone, and yet something of him remained, not in the halls of power, not in laws or ledgers, but in the places no one looked, in the cracks between stones, in the stillness between church bells, in the quiet between breaths. You see, not every legacy arrives like a banner unfurled in the wind. Some arrive like mist over the Seine, delicate, ungraspable, and yet unmistakably there. Long after his passing, the people of France carried him, not on their tongues, but in the soft weight behind their sighs. He wasn't remembered like a hero. He wasn't mourned like a martyr. But he wasn't forgotten either. There were old women in Montmartre who swore they saw him once, not on a throne, but in a chapel, kneeling, alone, his lips barely moving as if praying not to God, but to silence. In the winding alleys of Rouen, a cobbler told his apprentice how the king once visited in disguise, just to feel what it was like to walk unnoticed among the people. And in the gardens of St. Paul, the same ones overgrown now with ivy and ash, there was talk of a pale figure, tall, tired, appearing some dawns, simply to stand among the roses. Not moving, not speaking, just being. People didn't fear these stories. They didn't scoff. They just listened and nodded. Because somehow it made sense. This was Charles's kingdom now, not in gold, but in ghost. In memory, in air, in the silence between moments. Even the scribes, hardened men who inked the victories of kings, sometimes found their hands slowing when they wrote of him. One wrote, "He did not rule with might, but with the ache of a soul too open. He did not conquer, but he endured." And in that endurance, we see a mirror we cannot ignore. He wasn't the king they dreamed of, but he was the king they got. A human king, fragile, haunted, strange, yes, but also tender, in an age when kings burned villages to prove their might. Charles would sometimes stop a parade just to listen to the choir of a nearby convent. When knights were at their fealty in stone courtyards, he was known to respond not with declarations, but with the soft nod of a man who'd rather be somewhere else. And on the rare days when his mind was clear, he would sit by the window and simply watch the clouds, the trees, the people walking far below. Some guards joked he was mad, but others, the quieter ones, said he sees things we don't. And maybe he did. Maybe the madness was never madness at all. Maybe it was just an old soul born into a world too loud, a world of iron and fire, when his heart was made of wool and rain. After his death, the court did what courts do. They moved on. Letters were sent. Titles changed hands. Tapestries were taken down. His name replaced, but not erased. Because when a king dies quietly, the silence he leaves behind becomes part of the world. And for Charles, that silence was a kind of echo. You could feel it in the marble of St. Denis, in the worn floorboards of St. Paul, in the soft eyes of servants who remembered his softer days. There was a nurse, long since old, who once whispered to her granddaughter, "He had the saddest smile I've ever seen," like someone who tasted every sorrow and still offered you kindness. A boy who once brought firewood to the palace said, "He looked at me like I mattered, like he really saw me." And a young scribe, years after Charles's burial, found a torn piece of parchment tucked behind a loose stone in the library wall. On it, written in trembling hand, "I wish I could dream without waking." No name, no seal, just those words. Some say it was his. Others say it doesn't matter, because those 7 words say more than an entire reign ever could. Even now, Kaif, even now. The dream of Charles VI still stirs when snow falls unexpectedly in Paris. Some say it's him walking the old paths again. When a candle flickers just once in a still room, some say it's his breath passing through. Not to haunt, not to stay, just to be felt, to remind us that even the softest voices leave an imprint, even the most broken kings can be beautiful in their stillness. And even now, centuries later, the story isn't done, not yet, because someone still remembers. And memory Kaif is a kingdom all its own, and now we return to stillness. The story of Charles VI, the dream-bound king of France, does not end with fire or thunder or blood. It ends as it lived, softly, quietly, like candlelight flickering low in the deepest hours of the night. He came into the world beneath winter skies, born to marble halls and whispered prayers, the son of a wise king, the heir to an ancient crown, a prince wrapped not only in linens and silk, but in expectation, in prophecy, in pressure too heavy for his narrow shoulders. And from the beginning, he slept more than he woke. Perhaps he always knew the world was too loud for him. As he grew, France asked for strength, and he gave them gentleness. They demanded clarity, and he gave them questions. They needed fire, and he offered frost. He didn't fight like the kings before him. He didn't roar. He didn't conquer. He wandered. He paused. He dreamed. And for this, history called him mad. But madness is just a name we give to what we don't understand. Was it madness? To see saints in shadows? To hear music in silence? To stop a royal procession just to marvel at a garden in bloom? Was it madness? To be tender in an age of brutality? To weep openly at a painting? To retreat inward when the world shouted outward? He ruled for decades, but not always in presence. Often he was absent, not in body, but in spirit, lost behind eyes that watched, but didn't see. In his lucid hours, he spoke with startling clarity. He recalled verses, patterns, and stars, stories of nights long buried, but in other hours, darker hours, he did not recognize his wife. He did not know his children. He believed he was made of glass. He fled from mirrors. He avoided touch, and yet he was not feared. He was grieved, because those closest to him knew, behind the veil of confusion, behind the wandering gaze, there was still Charles, still the boy who toddled through mossy courtyards, still the boy who listened to poetry in the dark, still the child who curled his fingers around his mother's hand in sleep. And when death finally came for him, not with violence, but with silence, he met it not with struggle, but with peace. They say the sky that day was gray and still. The people did not cheer. There were no grand proclamations, just bells, ringing slow and low across the rooftops of Paris. Somewhere in the royal chapel, a nurse who once cradled him as a babe lit a single candle and whispered a prayer for the king who could not stay awake. And in a quiet hallway of St. Paul, a window pane held the faint trace of a frost-drawn spiral, the kind he used to trace with absent fingers. The king was gone, but his softness remained. It lingered in the way sunlight passed through stained glass, in the pause between choral notes echoing through old cathedrals, in the warm hush of gardens long forgotten by history books. Centuries passed, kings rose, revolutions tore through the land. Crowns were melted, stones were shattered, but the story of Charles VI remained, not shouted from battlements, but whispered in candlelight. Artists painted him not with swords, but with folded hands. Poets did not praise his victories, they mourned his sorrow. And children in villages far from Paris were told stories of the king who saw angels in doorways and feared shattering from a touch. He became not a symbol of failure, but of something far rarer, a symbol of humanity, because in his quiet, he reminded us that not every soul is built for rule, that some hearts are too tender for thrones, that some minds wander not because they are lost, but because they are looking for something no kingdom can give. And tonight, dear listener, as your breath slows, as your limbs grow heavy under the gentle weight of sleep, perhaps you feel it too. That ache, that beauty, that understanding. Because deep down, we are all a little like Charles. We all carry invisible crowns. We all battle storms no one else sees. We all retreat sometimes into the quiet rooms of our own minds. And that doesn't make us broken. It makes us real. So rest now. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on the Seine. Let the warmth of this story wrap around you like a velvet cloak. And if you find yourself dreaming of stone courtyards, of flickering candlelight, of roses blooming quietly in forgotten gardens, perhaps you will see him there, not in madness, not in sorrow, but simply walking gently, peacefully, finally free. The boy who dreamed, the man who wandered, the king who slept. Good night, sweet listener, and sleep like a king.